Erev Tov Binyamina. Good morning, Menlo Park. Greetings to friends of Israel from around the world. My name's Wayne Firestone. I'm the executive director of the America-Israel Friendship League. And yes, it's hot where I'm sitting. It's probably hot where you're sitting. I'm already seeing in the chat people calling in from Kuwait, from London, from around the United States. We get that it's hot. We get that we're headed into, here in the United States, Independence Day weekend, which normally is a big celebration. This year, perhaps for the first time for many in a long time, outdoors and with others. My question to you all before we begin is, how are you going to celebrate independence this weekend? If you're in the United States and you're celebrating on July 4th, make sure you don't show up for our Sunday webinar. We won't be there. We're doing our webinar on Monday the 5th in honor of the holiday. We hope you'll join us then. But put in the chat maybe a little bit this year how you intend to celebrate independence and democracy, because indeed that is the topic we're going to be discussing today with one of Israel's foremost experts on Israeli democracy, Dr. Arye Carmon, who I'll introduce in a moment. You know, the past couple of years, I've had this group of friends that we get together in the backyard in the Washington, D.C. area, and it might sound a little corny, but we read the Constitution, the United States Constitution, out loud as part of our festivities before the fireworks go off. And I guess if Israel ever does create a constitution, one of the people who are going to be held responsible for that is Dr. Arye Carmon, who has spent much of his life and his professional pursuits advancing democracy in Israel, but also very specifically asking the question about what governance, what democracy is like, both with a constitution and without a constitution. And we're going to explore that actually in a great level of detail. Dr. Carmon comes to us with impeccable credentials. He's currently a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and Stanford. He was the founder and director of the Israel Democracy Institute, which is a winner of a lifetime prize for contribution, of lifetime contributions for the Israel Prize. And we are so grateful to have him with us. The last time I was with him, it was over a dinner table in person before COVID in the Bay Area. And I know he has been a tireless advocate on behalf of a constitution for Israel. In fact, he is the author of a book, Building Democracy on Sand, Israel Without a Constitution. So I guess this year, nobody's going to be reading an Israeli constitution out loud over Independence Weekend. But will that day come, do you think, at some point?
Listen, I never lose my optimism. It's necessary. If I only knew the date, my life would have been much different. I can assure you about that.
Well, we're glad to discuss the book, discuss your life's work, and indeed, you know, we're normally we celebrate in a democracy after an election because a peaceful transfer of power in a democracy is so important. We've had our own challenges here in the United States. Other democracies around the world have had their share of challenges, but Israel's a unique democracy. And I know you've taken the time to present to experts around the world who study and look at comparative government and comparative legal systems. We're looking forward today to your presentation to learn a little bit more about both the challenges that Israel's facing, as well as what are some of the open issues that you see in the coming period.
Okay, if we are ready to go, I'm ready to go. Why don't we put the first slide of the presentation, if possible?
Great, we will.
Okay, before moving forward, just by means of introduction, I'm very thankful to all the audience, and I hope that my presentation will clarify many of the dilemmas and questions that have arisen in the last several years. I want to mention the name of a very, very dear friend, a great American, very dear friend of the State of Israel, who passed away at the age of 100 a few months ago, and that is George Shultz. I was very fortunate to have George as a mentor and as a personal friend. And I have to say that during the 2020 COVID era, we had a number of conversations about the State of Israel. And when I described to George the crisis here, he did not feel very comfortable. So for his sake, and this would be my introductory words, I said to George, when you observe Israel, you have to make a distinction between hardware and software. In 73 years, Israel made wonders in building very powerful hardware. We have very powerful army. We have very strong economy. Israel is a real empire in anything pertaining to the technological revolution. We have all the institutions, etc. But when we talk about the political structure, when we talk about the software that drives political culture and drives politics in Israel, there are many, many vulnerabilities. So this presentation is an adjustment for my presentation today from a previous one that I presented before a number of colleagues at Stanford University. The first slide, please. Next slide. Okay, just a few words. And no, go to the first if you can. Go to the first, yeah. Few words about parliamentarian democracy. I know that I'm talking. Can you stick to the first slide, please? I know that I'm talking to an audience who might be used to presidential systems, so just a few remarks. Most stable democracies today are parliamentarian democracy. I need to see that. In the parliamentarian democracy systems, voting in elections is for political parties, not for personalities. The prime minister, in most cases, is usually, though not only, the head of the party with the largest representatives in the parliament. In most cases, governance depends on the formation of coalitions. So, and this is a very important point that I suppose will come as we move along. So the political process in a democracy is based on a continuous process of compromise building process. The next slide, please. Yeah. My presentation, I want to touch about two variables. One is intact governance and political trust that comprise the necessary condition for a stable democratic process and the benchmark for the entire presentation. Now, the context, and this I'd like to underline and underscore, is very unique. Israel is very unique in many respects. And I'm going to go through very briefly the demography, our parliament that we call the Knesset, and of course the lack of a constitution. The next slide, please. Well, the pace of demographic changes in Israel and its political structure, and of course, and cultural repercussions is more rapid than in any other democracy. In 1948, when the state was established, the population in Israel was 803,000. 85% of those were Jews, and of those, more than 3/4 were Ashkenazi Jews, and the rest were what we call Oriental Jews. So we had a very homogeneous society at that time. In 1992, the population was 5.1 million. This is right at the beginning of the migration from the former Soviet Union. And today, we are 9.3 million. So the population growth in Israel is 1,200% in 73 years. And I very much would like to underscore this, because it may explain many of the domestic conflicts, the tear among different identities of different subgroups. Israel is by far a highly diversified, on the verge of going into divisiveness because of this structure. Next slide, please. The Knesset, and this must be noticeable. You don't see the end of this slide, but I will try to say, Israel has one of the smallest legislature in the world. In fact, the smallest per capita. And one of the very few houses of representatives which is unicameral. In other words, it does not have a second, an upper house or second house. And it is the only parliament that functions as a constitutional assembly. So there is a lot of anomalies concentrated in the foundation, if you will, of our democracy. This is one of the sources of the anomaly that will be reflected, I guess, from my presentation. Next, please. As Wayne mentioned, Israel does not have a constitution. It'll take a separate, I guess, lecture to explain why, but the fact of the matter is that Israel has a very weak constitutional foundation. It is based on 13 basic laws and no reasonable constitutional mechanism for amendments. Most of the basic laws could be amended with a simple majority. In fact, as we go along, some of the basic laws have been changed to adjust to the needs of the coalitions, first by Netanyahu and now by the new government. So this is one of the ills that stem from the fact that we do not have a stable constitution. One of the things that we do not have, of course, is definition of judicial review. Next slide, please. Okay. I don't know, you don't see the bottom of it, but let me explain. I am going to base my entire presentation about the current crisis in Israeli democracy, comparing the state of democracy in Israel between 1992 versus 2021, and it is going to be based on a triangular analysis. On the left-hand side, you see what I call political and governance structure. This includes all the institutions that comprise the functioning institution in democracy, starting from political parties, going to the Knesset, going to all the different structures in government that execute policies. And here, let me say and state that one of the most important institutions in any parliamentary democracy is the political party. The political party is, to a large extent, a mediating factor between the civil society and elected institutions. And we will come back to this as we go to the comparison between 1992 and 2021. The other side is the judicial branch and all those institutions that comprise the threshold and protect the laws. And the bottom line that unfortunately you don't see is the reflection of the interaction between these two on the political culture. In other words, the political behavior in any democracy results from the way institutions interact with the judicial branch that is mainly functioning to protect the norms and the foundation of democracy. Next slide, please. Next, please. Okay. Again, I hope that you see the bottom, because this is very important.
We can see it. So
okay, great.
I've heard back from others in the audience as well.
Okay. In June of 1992, there were elections in Israel and Rabin Labour Party was elected. Now I'd like to see, by means of comparison, in 1992, we had very few small parties. Altogether, five small parties that comprised 32 seats in the Knesset, one which was mid-sized, but two large parties, the Likud and Labour Party, that together comprised about 2/3 of our parliament, of the Knesset. And the coalition, Rabin's coalition, enabled Rabin to have 17 cabinet ministers, 13 from his own party, the Labour, and the rest from the two other parties. Now, this is very important because until 1995, all governments in Israel, the ruling party that was elected, had the majority among the ministers in the cabinet, so the prime minister and the government could have run policies. Israel went to wars, Israel introduced peace, Israel absorbed many immigrants because the core was very solid. When you look at the right hand of the presentation, you see the scenery today. 73 members of the Knesset out of 120 come out from small parties, one from mid-sized party, and actually the largest party, which is in my terms still mid-sized, this is the Likud party, has only 30 seats. I will come back later to explain what are the ramifications, because as you may know, what you may have read, this is a very, very unusual coalition that brought together small parties from the left-hand side of the political spectrum, through the center, and through the right end of the political spectrum. And it is very, very vulnerable when you first look at it. But as I said, we'll come to this later. Next slide, please. Now, when I go back to 1992, and this would be the basis for the comparison later on, the political and governance structure, governance in most parties in 1992 was based on democratic procedures. In other words, it was the party that selected the candidates to run for parliament. It was the party that decided about the platform on which the party presented itself before the election. And the ruling party, as I said before, held a controlling stake in the cabinet. Now, achievement by this government was pretty significant. The Oslo Accord, the absorption of about 50% from the former Soviet Union happened during that time, just by means of comparison and without, and I'd like to make it very clear, in 1977, Begin was elected, the head of the Likud, and he ran a government of 21, of which 14 came from his party. So it was a very stable government as well. And I would like to mention that under Begin, Israel achieved the peace process with Egypt. So this is just by means of sharing with you that until 1996, we had all the ingredients, if you will, for stable governments. Again, we don't have enough time to go into the crisis of 1996. I'll just mention by passing that for a lack of a constitution, the electoral system in 1996 was changed to a two-ballot system that practically broke the foundations of big parties and introduced what emerged later, and I'll make a comment in a few minutes about it, the personalization of politics at the expense of political parties. The judicial branch in 1992, the relationship really enjoyed the relationship of trust between the judicial and the executive branches. Again, we don't have enough time to go into defining it. And as I said, the political culture reflected these two things. Governance was stable, and political trust was there. In fact, it was the party that the civil society, when it went to the ballot, voted for. And it was based on very specific platforms. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, as I mentioned before, starting from 1996, going down the road, Israel reached the peak of personalization processes that replace party structures with organizations that lack processes of internal party democracy. This is very unusual when you compare the current scene in Israel, in which 10 of the 13 represented in the current Knesset, 10 of the 13 parties has no democratic procedures. And when you compare it with other countries in 2021, it is very unusual. In fact, in the last, I'll come to it in a minute, in the last several elections during the 2.5-year crisis, we did not vote for a party. We voted for a person. Now, this is very critical, and I'd like to underscore it. Since 2015, this is the filing for the indictment against Netanyahu. The former prime minister was a catalyst of a metamorphosis that threatened democratic foundations of democracy in Israel. It really tore society apart. Netanyahu, who faced charges and faced, was indicted, tried in different ways to deal with his personal problems through the electoral system. One of the results was 4 consecutive elections in 2 years, devoid of policy issues. The exclusive focus in each and every one of the 4 election campaigns was against or for Netanyahu. And in each of these 4 elections, the Netanyahu opponents won the majority, but the outcome, I think, was pretty much devastating. First of all, when we run into an election period, we have what we call transition governments. Transition governments have very limited powers. Until a new government is elected by the Knesset, a transitional government cannot perform as a regular government. There was a freeze on legislation. It was a freeze on the way the Knesset oversee the way of the executive. And above all, Israel today still run its budget based on the 2019 budget. In other words, Israel does not have a budget because of the lack, because of these continuous 4 times election. Next slide, please. I purposely put this slide here. You see here Netanyahu before he stepped into to face his judges, and in the corridor of the court, in an unprecedented way, Netanyahu actually raised his hand against the judicial system, surrounded by members of his parties. I say it with a great sorrow, but I think that one has to mention it because it is still with us. There have been delays in or no appointments of police commissioner, state prosecutor, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the things I think that tore our society apart. You are either supporters of Netanyahu and against Netanyahu. And one of the things that I want to mention, for a lack of a constitution and maybe for a lack of a tradition of responsibility to political sovereignty, many of the Likud parties claim that over 1 million voters voted for Netanyahu, hence the court may not have the legitimate way to deal with his charges. Next, please. Well, as I said, the political culture in 2021 reflects very much the broken relationship between both sides of the triangle that I showed before. As I said, the voting patterns in 2021 used to be for personalities. And this is very important because if in the past you knew you belong to the left end of the political map, the right end of the political map, and you voted for your ideology or political preferences, here, everything was based on personalities. And I would like to refer to what I said before. The majority of the political parties in and of itself are not democratic. They prepared the ground for the crisis that we found ourselves in the last 2.5 years. And as a result, there has been a significant erosion in the public's trust in the political process in general, and in the political systems institution in particular, as shown in the next slide. The next, please. Well, in my institution, the Israel Democracy Institute, we developed what we call the Democracy Index. Every year, the Israel Democracy Institute runs dozens and dozens of parameters to check the state of democracy. One of them is the level of trust in institutions. We started in 2003, so I cannot go back to 1992, but you can see the big difference. IDF always has been on the top of the list. The majority of Israelis have major trust in our army, and so have been the president. But as we go down, the Supreme Court, which enjoyed and throughout the 20th century very high level of trust, in 2003 had 70% and went down to 52%. The police enjoyed 66%, going down to 41%. And you see the Knesset going down, the government going down, and the political parties going down. And I want to mention to you one thing that might be very significant. You know, during the last operation in Gaza, there were rumors that Netanyahu initiated the operation because of his personal trouble. I personally don't believe in it. But the fact that 50% of the population did think that way tells you how low the trust in the system went. You see also at the bottom, I cannot see that, but you see the voting rates comparison between 1992 and 2021. One of the numbers, I'll come back to it later, one of the numbers, it went down. It went down in the 1990s into the 21st century. One of the numbers that are very significant is the voting rate among Israeli Arabs that went down to 45%. These have been very troubling numbers that again show the level of trust in the system itself. I don't have the analysis, but among young people, the rating vote were even lower. Next, please. Okay. I put this slide, this is taken from, the last operation, and I put this slide to show what I said at the beginning about Israel's hardware. On the right end of the slide, you see the rockets coming from Gaza, and on the left hand, you see an Iron Dome. 90% of the rockets were tackled by the Iron Dome. So this is just to demonstrate the level of the hardware in Israel that literally protected us. If you can just try to imagine what kind of devastating outcomes would have been if over 4,200 rockets would have fallen on civilian areas. Next, please. From the perspective of the benchmark of this presentation, the deteriorating of internet governance and political trust really brought the atrocities to concerns, the lack of a sound long-term strategy regarding the Palestinian issue. But I would like to put my finger on the damage wreaked on the fragile relations between Israeli Arabs and Jews. Next slide, please. You know, in recent decades, we used to say that the trend of Israelizations, namely integration among Israeli citizens that comprise about 20-21% of our population, has intensified. During the pandemic, I don't know how many Israelis are aware of it. During the pandemic, Israeli Arab medical workers were in the forefront that enabled Israeli civil society to survive the coronavirus. 17% of Israeli physicians are Arabs. See the percentage of nurses, and 47% of our pharmacists are Arabs. The outbreak of violence challenged the integration process of the nation's citizens. The next slide. Okay. I guess I need here, my son put it, I don't know how to do it. Maybe you can help. Oh, this, I put this slide as a piece of hope. You see the left end of the political map, the right end of the political map, and first of all, the cleavages. Jonathan, can you? Okay. You see the cleavages within Israeli society. On the left end, you see the liberal seculars, the centrist seculars, the Arabs, the ultra-Orthodox, and the ideological right. Israel, we didn't have time to go into it, but I think that this is one of the most important things that comprises Israeli society, is its cleavages. If we can go down, okay, now, you see at the bottom all the parties that today comprise the coalition. And this is the first time that under one coalition, you have political parties from the left, from the center, and from the right, including an Arab party. For the first time since the founding of the State of Israel, what you see here, Ra'am, by the way, it was legitimized by Netanyahu. Ra'am has become part and parcel of our coalition. One of my hopes, my big hope, is that this experience to sit together on the basis of willing compromises may lead to a different kind of language. In the past 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks, since this government was established, we've seen the renewal of different types of governance, appointments to different functions, and dealing with the new coming of the virus of the COVID-19, and continuing some of the achievements of Netanyahu's government with the Emirates. So the agenda for this political party is very challenging. The ultra-Orthodox is the only sector which is not represented in the coalition, but all the other branches of Israeli society are represented. And as I said, in a very, very fragile scene, following 2.5 years of ongoing crisis, following divisiveness in Israeli society, I am very much looking forward and hope that we may face a different kind of language, a different kind of rhetoric, and hopefully opening the door for a new horizons. Does this mean that we will solve all the problems that I shared with you? I'm not so sure. Are we going to have a constitution around the corner? I don't think so. But it might be a beginning of an understanding the importance of all those elements that comprise stability in our system. I thank you very much, and Wayne, I'm all yours.
Wow, where do we begin? There was so much really just kernels of insight from that, and thank you for the data and perspective on Israeli democracy dating back quite some time. So let's start with your slide that's comparing 1992 to 2021, where you showed a pretty stark contrast just on that's very objective. The number of small parties in 1992 was relatively small, 32, and now it's 73. And the large parties were large, 76, and we're now at 30. So first of all, are you proposing that we should set thresholds differently to prevent this outcome? What are the implications, first of all, of that shift from large to small? And should there be action taken to minimize that, as there have been in the past?
Well, Wayne and the audience, we felt, when I say we at the Israel Democracy Institute, in the middle of the 1990s, that the introduction of the two-ballot system would be devastating. And we fought against it, and we succeeded to repeal it at the beginning of the 21st century. Unfortunately, the outcome was that the big parties were destroyed, and we don't have it since then. Now, to your question, yes, of course, Israel needs desperately an electoral reform. We experienced an electoral reform. In the 1960s, we had the creation of two blocks, what we call the alignment, that down the road became Labour Party, and Gacha, that down the road became Likud Party. So on the shelves of the Israel Democracy Institute, we have a number of propositions of what should be done in terms of electoral reform. I'll tell you what the problem. The problem is, the goal is very clear. We need to come back to a situation where we have two major parties. When one wins, the other one comprises a solid opposition. However, in order to achieve it, small parties will have to commit suicide. We don't have time to explain how to move it, but we have very clear roadmap how to do it. But this would mean the disappearance of small parties on the left end of the political map and on the right end of the political map, getting together to two blocks, except for the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs, which is fine, but it needs very badly to reach that end. If you would ask me when, I don't have a clue, but maybe, following the last slide, with a slide of hope, we may see the winds of change helping in the next few years to lead toward the kind of electoral reform. I can make one comment. One of the members of the current coalition, who is Gideon Saar, who is now the Minister of Justice, he mentioned one of our propositions, and that is to introduce constituencies into the system. You know, in all, except for Holland, in each and every parliamentarian democracy, the system is built on constituencies and national lists. Israel and Holland are the only democracies that you vote, that the country itself is one constituency. So there is a lot to be done, and we hope that the day will come that we'll be able to implement it.
I know you've looked at, through IDI, numerous potential reforms and advocated for those in the past. And I know your background, your PhD is in European political systems and history. What are the, Americans know very little, as you know, generally about parliamentary government. If you were to benchmark Israel's democracy, and I know you do with other countries, who should we be looking at to say, here is what a more stable parliamentary democracy might look like? Here are some of the things that we know are working that Israel should aspire to.
Well, it is a complex question, but let me respond. I would say that by and large, most, if not all, parliamentarian democracies are stable democracies. I had a slide that I didn't put on that shows, I think, one of the big hurdles that exist in Israel, and it exemplifies the personalization. And a group of scientists from the Israel Democracy Institute compared personalization in Israel with 15 other countries. And Israel is by far reached the highest level, meaning in the most important institution in parliamentary democracy is the political party. And every place that you have political parties, you have the beginning of a guarantee for a stable government. Having said that, you know, the number of electoral systems is exactly the number of parliamentary democracies. The system in Denmark is not comparable to the one in Belgium. The one in Italy is not comparable to the one in Sweden. The one in Germany is not. In other words, each country adjusts its system to its own need. The equal things all over is, as I said, is that each system in most parliamentary democracies have constituencies. Now, this is very important because it allows the civil society to get closer to its representation, very much like in your own country, in the United States, even though your system is a majoritarian, meaning the winner always takes all. And in most parliamentary democracies, it is proportional representation, which is slightly different. But representation is based on the interaction between the representatives and the public.
So we have we are grateful to have a large audience from Canada on our webinars on a regular basis during this period of the pandemic. And early on, somebody pointed out that July 1st is when the Canadians will be celebrating. So they're ahead of us in a number of ways. But one of our viewers, Arthur, pointed out that under Pierre Trudeau, Canada for the first time developed a constitution recognizing its Francophone minority and others. Is that a model that can be used for Israel?
Well, for about 10 years, between 2000 and 29, in fact, I was involved in an effort to push for a constitution in the state of Israel. My partner, I should say, I was his partner, is the late Meir Shamgar, one of the presidents of the Supreme Court. At that time, we looked into a number of constitutions, I guess about 30 constitutions all over. Canada is built on a federated basis, but we definitely looked into the Canadian constitution, and we learned a lot from it. One of the things, since you mentioned it, one of the big hurdles is, let me go back. We do have, as I mentioned, 13 basic laws. The 13 basic laws actually dictate the way that we run the system. But Israel does not have a Bill of Rights. Let me repeat it. Israel does not have a Bill of Rights. If you ask Israeli, what is democracy? He'll tell you the rule of the majority, which is not the case. A democracy is meant to protect the rights and mainly the minorities. The case of Canada was a very great example, particularly what happened in Canada with Trudeau. Unfortunately, for a lack of a constitution, one of the things that some Israelis want to copy from Canada is the overrule that existed, that was introduced in Canada. Never, I think it was used just one. The overruling case is when the parliament tries to overrule the ruling of the Supreme Court, which in our case, for a lack of a constitution, exemplified the tension between the two institutions. But what I wanted to underscore, I think that one of the biggest hurdles that could have been overcome in 1949 is what is called freedom of religion, freedom from religion. Israel never settled the tension between state and religion. And we live in a situation where the ultra-Orthodox version of Judaism has the monopoly oppressing the reform movement, the conservative movement, or any other way of exemplifying the Jewish identity. And I think that this is one of the biggest hurdle right now. I think that we had a chance. In 2008, we were pretty close to resolve it. But again, it's very difficult to cry over, a spill of milk right now. But this is one of the biggest hurdles. But as you asked me at the beginning, you never lose hope. I think that if and when the system will stabilize, and one of the things that is on the table right now, which is very important, is what we call the basic law of legislation that will define judicial review for the first time, that will define the way of legislation and will anchor it on a constitutional foundation. So the road is very long and uphill, but step by step, maybe.
We have several questions coming in about related to your critique of the culture of personality, and I think you certainly offered the example of what it meant to have the prime minister at the head of the party. But some of our viewers have written in that they see this critique as potentially applicable to all the parties, including
Yeah, absolutely.
And I figure, could you just speak to that issue?
Absolutely. What paved the way for the personalization of the elections in the past 2.5 years was not Netanyahu. It was the crisis that started in 1996 and the deterioration of the structures of political party and the emergence of parties that were put together by personalities that dictated the bylaws of the party, that dictated who is going to be on the list, and deprived the institution called political party for what it used to be. So absolutely. We've seen this not just in 2015. It started back in 1996 and down the road. Look, if I go back to 2003, Arik Sharon was the prime minister. He effected the split of the Likud and he founded what was called then the Kadima party. He was the one who put together the list. He did not have the institution of the party that would vote for representation in the party or who is going to be to represent the political party in the Knesset. The same was with Ehud Olmert, who came after him. And the same, of course, by the way, the Likud party does have a bylaw that enforce the kind of democratic procedure. They did not use it for several years. But make no mistake, when I say that 10 of the 13 parties represented in the Knesset have no democratic procedure, I meant it. This is part of the anomaly that led to the crisis of the past 2.5 years.
Yeah, I'd wanted to ask you about that data point. Does that mean just that they don't have internal elections and it's sort of a top-down party choice? Is that your critique?
Look, generally, to use the terminology of a political scientist, the political party functions as an aggregate, okay? It mediates between the civil society and the elected officials. It forms the foundation for accountability. When a political party, in its conference, in its central committees, in whatever institutions, decides who is going to represent the party in the Knesset, this is the institution to which the members of the Knesset are accountable for. It exists in most parliamentarian democracies. It does not exist in Israel. So this procedure is very, very critical. I could go on and on and on, just by means of another example. In all democracies, including, by the way, the United States, the body that initiates legislation is the government or the cabinet. 90% of the legislation is offered by the government in order to, to implement policies. This was the case in Israel until 1996. I don't have the exact slide, but for about one decade, say between 2004 and 2014, private bills in the Knesset amounted to 20,000. We compared it with 10 other parliamentarian democracies, and the private bills offered in 10 other democracies did not amount to 1/3 of this. So this is another aspect of the disintegration of this institution, which in my view is so important in any political scenery.
So we have people calling them have two-party systems, and those we definitely have some critics of the two-party system in terms of how representative they are. You gave us an interesting footnote about the Ram Party, which has been a minority voice that has not been embraced by any of the large parties for various reasons. Do you see this as potentially, I thought I heard a kernel of hope just in that development. Is that something that the multi-party system is more likely to produce and be able to build some public confidence around that development?
I'm very thankful to this question, Wayne. Absolutely, positively. Look, as I mentioned before, in the last election, only 45% of the Arab citizens went to the ballots. And this is very disappointing because the Arab sector of Israeli society has the potential of bringing 21 seats in the Knesset. It shows the distrust. Now, for the first time, the fact that an Arab party, note, a religious Arab party, Ram is a religious Muslim party, was legitimized and is part of the coalition, is a real door opener. And we do hope that it will lead to a different kind of introduction of Arabs' involvement. I gave you the numbers of Arabs who are part and parcel of our medical system, which is amazing. When you go to any Israeli hospital, you face Arab doctors. So they have become part of our society. There are many, many issues, by the way, right now. We don't have the time to go into it. Violence in their society and the need to deal with that violence and so on and so forth. But yes, absolutely. This is really a kernel of hope.
I'm going to stay on the positive just for the moment, even though we debated beforehand why and how to call this a crisis. It was a good debate, a good discussion. I think your slide of 1992 versus the current election, it really gives us a lot of context for that and what we need to be concerned about as lovers of and friends of Israel. But there is something pretty remarkable about the coming together of ideological opponents in this current government, and to the point where some of the early commentaries, maybe they were Pollyannish, but they said, maybe America, maybe some other places that are struck with tremendous divisions could learn something from a government that brings together different coalition partners that disagree on a lot of things, but have some common causes together that allow them to form a government. Is this too? And I know there's a big, the whole government gets tested very soon based on a budget. Can they put together a budget? And so I'm not going to ask you to forecast how that budget vote will go, but I would be curious to hear your thoughts on what precedent this sets for all of democracy for this kind of coalition to be in place.
I would use one word: rehabilitating governance in the state of Israel. following the deteriorating crisis that started in 2015, as I mentioned, with the indictment of the former prime minister, I think that the challenges that this government is trying to face and pursue is, rehabilitating the foundations of governance in the state of Israel, rehabilitating political trust in the system. By the way, after a lot of divisive rhetoric that came from all sides of Israeli society, one of the great things that we feel in the past 3 weeks is a very quiet, serene tone, calming down the moods and trying to lead in a very different directions. Again, I may be too optimistic. I may read more from what I'm hoping for, but it is a real challenge to see together a minister coming from the very left end, whose only goal is two-state solution, sitting together with another minister, both women, by the way, from the very right end, and negotiating, knowing that they need to compromise about a very specific issue that the coalition is facing right now. It's a real change. It's a real change in the language. It's a real change in the interaction. So, as I said, maybe let me elaborate a little bit. In my book that you mentioned before.
By the way, wait, I see it on your desk. We'll give a little wave because we're coming up at the top of the hour, and I want people to see the image. We used it in the invitation, and okay. Just as you're closing up on this final thought, maybe you could. I know you're the photographer behind the book cover as well, so I'd love to.
I will mention it.
Please.
I will mention it, but in my book, I mentioned, Israel is the very first experience of the Jewish people with taking responsibility for political processes. For 2,000 years, Jews did not carry any responsibility for their own political sovereignty. Israel is the very first. And as I said, having a society that grew in 73 years by 1,200% is a huge challenge. And if you just internalize the meaning, you start to understand all the roots of the vulnerability. So I feel personally, and this is one of my motivations to found the Israel Democracy Institute, to have been born into a time that we can make a difference, that we can lay the foundations. The cover of the book, it's a photograph that I took from a helicopter in Namibia in a sunrise over the dunes. I love it. And of course, it symbolizes what the title of my book is, Building Democracy on Sand. Hopefully, the sand one day will become a very solid ground on which our grandchildren and great-grandchildren could be in a more stable situation.
Dr. Carmon, thank you so much for giving us, as you said, you could have done a separate lecture on each one of these different topics, but everyone has the advantage of actually being able to read the book and take their knowledge a step deeper. We have a number of questions that we didn't get to today, and so I highly encourage everyone to take a look and to take a read, because that's one way you can celebrate democracy in both of our countries as well, and in countries around the world. We'll take contributions. This is one, I think, where using your hardware and software imagery up front, there is no intellectual property on democracy. We should take the best of what we can learn from around the world. We've watched that happen on our webinar series as we watch parliamentarians, local and national, come together. We bring to Israel, when we're allowed to travel, people from different aspects of civil society and in government that are trying to strengthen the institutions of democracy. We do that because these are common values in our societies, and this is something that we should celebrate. So remember, don't celebrate by coming to our webinar this Sunday on the 4th of July, because we won't be there. We will be there on the 5th of July. We'll be celebrating great art in art galleries as part of a cultural celebration for Independence Weekend. However you decide to celebrate, please make sure you do it safely, and we look forward to being with you throughout the summer in this fascinating series. Thanks again, Dr. Carmon, and everybody have a wonderful week and Independence Day weekend for those of you celebrating.
Thank you very much.